It was the morning of May 10th, 1940, just after 4:30, when dawn began to break over the Belgian border. Lieutenant Ian Roger English of the Durham Light Infantry stood watching the horizon from his defensive position in northern France. His father had served in this same regiment during the Great War, working as a mining engineer before the conflict drew him in. English himself had joined the 8th Battalion back in 1938, and now, as darkness fell across Europe, he was about to witness something that would shatter every belief about how modern warfare actually worked. What would unfold in the next 6 weeks would fundamentally change military thinking for generations. On paper, the German army looked weaker. The numbers seemed to favor the Allies decisively. More tanks belonged to the British and French, more divisions were theirs. The artillery matched up roughly equally. France alone had mobilized 800,000 soldiers and stood as Europe's most formidable military power. When the British Expeditionary Force arrived, it brought with it 390,000 well-trained, well-equipped troops, confident they had prepared adequately for defense. Yet within just 42 days, France would surrender completely. The British would be forced to flee across the Channel from the beaches of Dunkirk. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg would all fall to conquest. Something mathematically impossible had happened. A supposedly inferior force had beaten a superior one using methods the Allies couldn't even recognize. But this wasn't simply a story about better equipment or sheer numbers. This was the tale of how one military organization revolutionized warfare through exceptional training, innovative doctrine, and a philosophy of command so fundamentally different from their opponents that it made victories seem impossible become reality. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to where it began, not on the battlefields of the Second World War, but in the wreckage left behind by the First one. November 11th, 1918. The Great War had ended, and Germany had lost. Nearly 2 million German soldiers lay dead after 4 years of merciless fighting. When the Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, the victors imposed severe limitations designed to make sure Germany could never pose a threat to European peace again. The German army shrank to just 100,000 men. No tanks were permitted, no aircraft, no heavy artillery. Poison gas was forbidden. The General Staff, that elite group of military planners who had guided Prussian and German forces for over 100 years, was officially eliminated. The prestigious Kriegsakademie, where some of history's greatest military strategists had been trained, received orders to shut its doors permanently. Germany's military situation looked hopeless. Most nations facing such restrictions would have simply accepted the limits and struggled to rebuild slowly within them. But Germany chose a different path entirely. Rather than surrender to these constraints, German military leaders transformed restriction into advantage and limitation into possibility. When General Hans von Seeckt took command of the shrunken Reichswehr in 1920, he made a decision that would alter military history. If Germany could only maintain 100,000 soldiers, then those 100,000 would become the finest soldiers on earth. Von Seeckt's approach was unlike anything military establishments had attempted before. He designed the army around a core principle: every soldier would be trained well above his actual rank. This wasn't wishful thinking or theoretical idealism. It was careful, methodical planning for the moment when restrictions would fall away and rapid expansion would become necessary. Each man would master not just his current position, but the responsibilities 2 ranks above him. A squad leader would train to command a company. A company commander would prepare to lead a battalion. A battalion commander would study to direct a brigade. The training wasn't confined to classrooms or chalkboards. It involved intensive practical preparation that assumed every leader might suddenly face command of forces much larger than they currently controlled. This philosophy carried echoes of Prussia's deep military heritage. The Prussian tradition embraced something called mission-type tactics, a concept simple in its elegance but revolutionary in its scope. A commander received a mission and learned what goal needed achieving. What remained unspecified was exactly how to accomplish it. This created a stark difference from how most armies operated, where commanders issued precise orders that dictated not only the objective but the exact methods for reaching it. Mission-type tactics demanded something crucial: trust. It required subordinates capable of independent thought. It required leaders at every level who grasped not just their own assignments, but the broader intentions of commanders above them in the hierarchy. The German training system was methodically designed to produce exactly these kinds of leaders. From 1919 until 1933, even while operating under Versailles restrictions, the Germans conducted war games at scales previously unseen. These weren't small unit exercises or limited drills. They were enormous systematic simulations of modern warfare that included multiple layers of command working simultaneously. Officers practiced coordinating infantry, artillery, and theoretical armored forces that Germany wasn't yet permitted to have. They war-gamed massive scenarios involving divisions, corps, and entire armies using forces that existed nowhere except in imagination and on maps. The exercises demanded brutal honesty. Failures were dissected without mercy. Victories were analyzed to find patterns worth repeating. Every officer involved had to produce after-action reports that circulated throughout the officer corps. The lessons of the First World War received unflinching examination. The static trench warfare that had claimed millions of lives represented the past, not the future. That style of warfare had nearly destroyed Germany. Movement was what mattered now. Speed was the future. The capacity to make decisions faster than your enemy became the future. These weren't idle philosophical discussions. They became the foundation of deliberate military development. The General War School, officially shut down by Versailles requirements, continued operating secretly under different forms. Chosen officers attended demanding courses covering far more than tactics alone. They studied logistics and grasped that armies moved along supply lines. They studied transportation, recognizing that railroads and motor vehicles would determine modern combat. They studied intelligence gathering and learned to assess enemy strengths and intentions. They studied economics, understanding that industrial production would decide long-term military outcomes. They studied diplomacy, recognizing how international relationships shaped strategic possibilities. The training was comprehensive because the Germans knew modern warfare demanded more than tactical excellence. It required officers who could think in tactical, operational, and strategic terms simultaneously. The training stressed one critical element that would prove vital in coming conflicts: independent thinking within a clear framework of intent. German officers received explicit instruction that making a sound decision immediately was superior to waiting for perfect information. In actual battle, delay meant death. Opportunities appeared and vanished within moments. A commander waiting for complete information, postponing action until uncertainty disappeared, would watch chances slip away. This principle was hammered into every officer through endless exercises designed to create pressure, confusion, and chaos. The Germans understood that battle was inherently chaotic. Plans fell apart the moment they made contact with the enemy. Officers needed comfort operating amid disorder and making sound decisions despite incomplete information. They had to adapt as circumstances shifted. This culture encouraged junior officers to take initiative without requesting approval. Squad leaders thought like company commanders, understanding how their specific actions served larger objectives. Every soldier grasped that on the battlefield, the person on the ground usually possessed better information than the general miles away in headquarters. This extended to a practice called leading from the front. German commanders didn't run battles from safe headquarters positioned miles behind the lines. They positioned themselves forward, where they could observe directly what was happening, where they could issue orders based on personal observation rather than delayed reports filtered through multiple command layers. This was costly. German officers and generals died at rates far higher than their Allied counterparts. But the advantage in decision speed proved overwhelming. While Allied commanders waited for information traveling up bureaucratic chains and for orders returning down through the same channels, German commanders made real-time decisions based on what they personally witnessed. The difference in operational speed could be measured in hours, sometimes entire days. By 1933, when the Nazi Party assumed power, Germany had devoted 14 years to building the intellectual foundations for a new kind of warfare. The physical equipment would arrive later. Tanks, aircraft, and motorized divisions remained years away. but the thinking was already systematic and ready. When Adolf Hitler openly began rebuilding the German military in 1935, tearing up the Versailles restrictions, he acquired a force that understood exactly who it needed to become. Heinz Guderian, a signals officer, had spent the 1920s pursuing an idea that most military experts dismissed as crazy. Tanks shouldn't merely support infantry by moving forward slowly to help soldiers capture defensive positions. Instead, tanks should function as the primary striking force, massed into powerful formations and supported by motorized infantry and aircraft. To conventional European military thinking, this was radical heresy. They remembered the tanks of the First World War, mechanical failures prone to breakdowns, moving at walking pace, vulnerable to artillery fire and mechanical collapse. But Guderian had studied British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, who argued that tanks could transform warfare if employed properly. He had examined Soviet deep battle concepts, which emphasized breaking through enemy defenses and striking far into rear areas. He merged these ideas with Prussian principles of maneuver warfare and decisive engagement. The result became what Western journalists called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The Germans themselves used a different term, Bewegungskrieg, the war of movement. Blitzkrieg never appeared in actual German military manuals. Journalists invented the term to describe what they observed happening. The operational concept involved finding a weak point in enemy defenses through reconnaissance, then concentrating overwhelming force at that exact point. Tanks, artillery, infantry, and air support converged on a narrow sector. The overwhelming local superiority broke through the defensive line, even when overall numbers favored the defenders. Fast-moving armored columns then drove deep into enemy rear areas, destroying command centers, severing supply routes, surrounding enemy forces, and generating widespread chaos. This required precise coordination between tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and aircraft, providing close support. It demanded speed of execution. It required the ability to immediately seize breakthrough opportunities within hours, without waiting for higher command approval. The training systems developed during the Weimar period, when Germany possessed no tanks and officially maintained no general staff, had been specifically designed for this exact kind of warfare. By 1939, the pieces were all in place. The Reichswehr had grown from 100,000 men to over 3 million. It now included several panzer divisions built around concentrated armor formations. It had developed radio communication systems, enabling unprecedented coordination between ground and air units. This technological advantage was crucial and frequently overlooked. While Allied tanks still relied on flag signals and runners delivering messages, German tank commanders could speak to each other via radio, coordinate maneuvers in real time, and call in aircraft support through radio equipment installed in command vehicles. Every German tank commander had a radio. Numerous Allied tank crews had no radios whatsoever, making real-time coordination during combat nearly impossible. This single technological difference, combined with doctrine that exploited it maximally, created an enormous advantage in battlefield pace and decision-making. The Luftwaffe had been built from the start to support ground operations. Unlike the Royal Air Force, which prioritized strategic bombing and air control, or the French Air Force, which was fragmented and poorly coordinated, the Luftwaffe trained continuously alongside army units. The Stuka dive bomber, with its distinctive inverted gull wings and wailing sirens, functioned as flying artillery. It delivered precise strikes against enemy strongpoints, breaking through defensive positions that ground artillery couldn't adequately suppress. Stuka pilots trained alongside panzer commanders, establishing procedures for close air support that would prove devastatingly effective. Luftwaffe and army officers attended identical staff colleges, studied the same doctrine, and participated in combined arms exercises, emphasizing coordination and mutual reinforcement. September 1, 1939. Poland. The world witnessed its first demonstration of what Germany had systematically built over 2 decades of preparation. At 4:45 in the morning, the invasion commenced. The aging German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, positioned in Danzig harbor under the pretext of commemorating the anniversary of the Battle of Tannenberg, opened fire on Polish installations at Westerplatte. World War II had begun. Simultaneously, German forces crossed the border from three separate directions. Army Group North attacked from Pomerania and East Prussia. Army Group South advanced from Silesia and Slovakia. Over 60 divisions, supported by nearly 4,000 aircraft, moved against Polish forces. The Polish military was substantial, fielding 1 million soldiers and reasonably equipped by European standards. It possessed quality cavalry units and competent artillery forces. Polish soldiers displayed extraordinary courage, yet they were completely unprepared for the warfare methods Germany deployed. The campaign showed operational speeds that astonished military observers around the world. German forces executed their doctrine precisely as trained. Throughout the opening hours, Luftwaffe bombers and fighters struck Polish positions, targeting air defenses, troop concentrations, and transportation networks. The powerful Luftwaffe decimated much of the Polish Air Force within days, leaving the Polish army defenseless against German panzer divisions. Armored columns raced over 100 miles in the opening 5 days, a pace that defied conventional military expectations. The Luftwaffe established air superiority within 48 hours through methodical attacks on Polish airfields, then shifted to supporting ground operations and striking infrastructure targets. Panzer divisions broke through Polish defensive lines at weak points identified through reconnaissance, then raced deep into rear areas. Polish forces found themselves encircled, cut off from supply, unable to organize counterattacks as German forces destroyed their command posts or overran them entirely. The speed with which German tanks cut through Polish defenses introduced new terminology to military vocabulary. The combination of air power and armor moving with speed created results that traditional military thinking couldn't explain. Within 2 weeks, the campaign's conclusion was already certain. Polish forces launched a counterattack along the Bzur River from September 9 through 15, attempting to exploit German forces concentrated in the center. German Army Group South repositioned to meet this threat, forcing Polish units into narrow front fighting where they faced encirclement again. Meanwhile, Heinz Guderian's columns pushed hard eastward. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland from the opposite side, eliminating any remaining Polish hope. The final operational Polish units surrendered on October 6th. German casualties totaled 14,000 dead or missing, with 30,000 wounded from 150,000 troops engaged. Polish casualties reached 66,000 dead, 130,000 wounded, and 400,000 captured from 800,000 troops involved. The entire campaign lasted 35 days from invasion through capitulation. Many Western observers dismissed Poland as inadequately prepared, employing outdated tactics against modern methods. The Allied High Command had convinced themselves that Germany's victory over Poland meant little. Surely the Wehrmacht would face a different reality when confronted by truly professional militaries like France and Britain. The moment of truth arrived on May 10, 1940, when German forces unleashed their assault. Before sunrise, German armies crashed across the borders of the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France in one coordinated offensive. Every movement had been meticulously planned. Deception operations masked the true German intentions. Coordination between different army groups proceeded like clockwork. The Allies had prepared their response with equal care, developing what they called the Dial Plan, named for a river in Belgium. The strategy seemed logical enough. French and British forces would thrust forward into Belgium, establishing defensive positions along natural geographical obstacles. It was conventional military wisdom, built on assumptions about how Germany would conduct the invasion. Allied commanders were convinced the Germans would simply repeat their World War I tactics, pushing through Belgium in a massive sweeping arc to encircle France from the north. Acting on these convictions, French commanders sent their strongest formations, including 3 entire armored divisions, racing into Belgium. The British Expeditionary Force, numbering nearly 400,000 troops, moved to positions alongside their French allies. Both armies settled in, prepared to wage a grinding defensive battle on prepared lines. France could field 800,000 soldiers and possessed modern equipment including tanks that outmatched German armor in both protection and firepower. Neither the French nor the British had any idea that the real German attack was coming elsewhere entirely. The invasion through Belgium was a decoy, a masterfully executed feint designed to draw Allied armies away from where the actual decisive blow would fall. The real assault was punching through the Ardennes forest, a region French military planners had dismissed as utterly impassable for large mechanized forces. French generals spoke with absolute certainty about this. They were catastrophically wrong. General Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group A, comprising 44 divisions including 7 panzer divisions, was threading its way through the forest with astonishing speed and efficiency. The narrow forest roads that French planners had assumed would choke any advance had been thoroughly reconnoitred by German engineers during peacetime. Routes had been carefully selected and marked. Bridges had been surveyed and documented. German units had conducted rehearsals through similar terrain. The operation left nothing to chance. German motorcycle units spearheaded the advance, their engines roaring through narrow defiles, followed by panzer columns moving in careful formation. On May 13th, as German formations reached the Meuse River, French defenders expected to have several days before any crossing attempt could be mounted. German combat engineers, laboring under fire from French positions, completed bridgeheads across the Meuse within a single day. French planners had assumed this task would consume at least 4 days. This was not superhuman achievement. It was the product of rigorous training, of units practicing exactly this mission repeatedly, of equipment pre-positioned and ready, of procedures refined through dozens of exercises. German tanks began crossing at Sedan on May 13, 1940, at a spot that completely bypassed the mighty Maginot Line, that enormous chain of concrete fortifications stretching along the Franco-German frontier. The breakthrough came precisely where French defenses were thinnest, guarded by reserve divisions lacking the experience and resources of frontline formations. This was no accident. German reconnaissance had systematically identified this weakness through patient observation. German military doctrine had always emphasized finding and exploiting enemy weak points, rather than hurling forces against positions of strength. The gap would not be sealed. French forces simply lacked the means to close it. German panzer divisions, now in vast numbers, began pouring through the rupture. Within hours, they were racing across open countryside toward the Atlantic coast. What followed demonstrated the raw effectiveness of German training and doctrine applied on a massive operational scale. Armored formations raced toward the English Channel, covering distances in days that military experts had insisted would require weeks. Heinz Guderian, commanding the 19th Panzer Corps, drove forward in his command vehicle, making tactical decisions in real time based on what he observed directly. When superiors ordered him to halt and stabilize his flanks, worried about exposure, Guderian simply delayed compliance for hours, then resumed his advance, while claiming he was conducting reconnaissance in force. In another army, this would have been rank insubordination. In the German military system, it was initiative in service of the commander's overall intent. Tank commanders at every level operated with remarkable independence, making decisions without waiting for permission from higher headquarters. Encountering resistance, they simply bypassed it and kept driving, leaving slower motorized infantry to mop up any surrounded German forces. The priority was always maintaining momentum, keeping the enemy disoriented, preventing any possibility of organized defense. This velocity created profound paralysis in Allied command structures. By the time British and French commanders processed reports of German positions, those positions had already shifted miles away. Intelligence reached headquarters slowly. Analysis consumed more hours. Orders then took additional time traveling back to units. By the moment Allied forces attempted to respond to German locations, the Germans had already moved on. The tempo of warfare had simply overwhelmed Allied decision cycles. This was no accident or fortunate circumstance. It resulted from decades of training that elevated speed of decision above perfection of information, that gave junior officers freedom to act on their own judgment, that stationed commanders forward where they could observe and decide based on direct evidence. British Lieutenant Ian Roger English commanded a carrier platoon in the 8th Battalion Durham Light Infantry. On May 21st, near Arras, his platoon occupied positions facing German forces that materialized where they absolutely should not have been able to appear. The Germans moved with a synchronization and swiftness that violated every principle about how armies actually operated. Under English's capable command, his small carrier platoon performed what senior officers would later describe as remarkable feats of valor, holding their ground despite being outnumbered and experiencing the terrifying novelty of being attacked by dive-bombing Stukas. French tank formations, despite often possessing superior vehicles, could not coordinate their responses. The Char B-1 bis offered better armor protection and armament than anything Germany possessed. The Saumur S-35 cavalry tank surpassed the German Panzer III in both speed and firepower. Yet French tanks were parceled out among infantry divisions as direct support rather than concentrated for massive breakthroughs. They possessed no radio systems for communication. French doctrine rejected the concentrated exploitation tactics that Germany had developed over 2 decades. German forces were simply operating faster than Allied command could handle. By May 19, 1940, German armored spearheads had reached Abbeville on the coast. They had traveled 240 kilometers in 9 days, severing the British Expeditionary Force and France's best divisions in Belgium from the main French army. The situation had become hopeless. Evacuation represented the only remaining option. From May 26 through June 4, over 338,000 Allied troops escaped from Dunkirk beaches in Operation Dynamo. The British regarded it as a miraculous rescue. The Germans saw it as outright victory. The evidence supported both perspectives. France's defeat was not a consequence of inferior equipment. This requires emphasis because it contradicts popular understanding. German tanks were actually inferior to French tanks in armor protection and firepower in numerous direct comparisons. Germany possessed fewer tanks overall than the combined Allied inventory. Only 10% of the German army relied on motorized transport. The overwhelming majority still depended on horses, moving as armies had for centuries. The triumph emerged from doctrine, from training, from how commanders were selected and instructed. Germany had concentrated armor into powerful panzer divisions rather than dissipating it among infantry formations. German commanders made decisions at combat speed rather than administrative speed. Soldiers at all levels grasped their overall mission and had been trained to seize opportunities when circumstances allowed. French historian Marc Bloch, who participated in the campaign and afterward produced a devastating analysis called Strange Defeat, described what he termed German skill at appearing where they had no business appearing. This was not magic. It was reconnaissance identifying weak points, command making rapid decisions to exploit those vulnerabilities, and subordinate officers executing those decisions with initiative and speed. The training system generating this capability had no Allied equivalent. Beginning from their initial military instruction, German soldiers received systematic teaching to think 2 ranks above their position. This was not merely inspirational, it involved formal instruction with concrete objectives. Junior squad leaders participated in company exercises where they made decisions typically assigned to officers 2 ranks higher. Company commanders trained with battalion-level problems, directing forces vastly larger than they normally commanded. These exercises contained no scripts. They introduced deliberate chaos, friction, and confusion. Officers received incomplete information, yet were expected to decide anyway. Hesitation brought punishment. Initiative received reward even when that initiative produced failures. The message was unmistakable. During actual combat, doing something usually exceeded doing nothing. Waiting for complete information meant losing fleeting opportunities. Map exercises happened at every level from squad through army group. These were not leisurely classroom lectures. They required officers to draft orders rapidly, clearly, and with precision under genuine time constraints. Every exercise centered on speed of decision. The army that decided faster would seize the initiative and maintain it. Junior officers absorbed this principle so thoroughly it became instinctive. One German officer, explaining their training philosophy, noted that map exercises represented the superior method of instruction. Without excessive effort, countless decisions were necessary, and officers, particularly younger ones, were compelled to compose their orders quickly, clearly, and precisely. Every participant had to make decisions and execute them. This approach worked at all levels. Through terrain models and map exercises, company commanders developed their platoon leaders, while platoon leaders refined their squad leaders. The selection process for the General Staff represented extraordinary competition, creating an elite within an elite. Before World War I, roughly 150 officers from the entire military annually began the demanding 3-year program at the Kriegsakademie. These were not politically connected appointees. Competitive examinations determined selection, testing tactics, military history, mathematics, and languages. The process was designed to identify sharp intellect, original thinking, and leadership capacity. Of those candidates, roughly 30% successfully completed the 3-year course and passed final examinations. These tests demanded more than military knowledge. Examiners evaluated personality, character, general education, and personal conduct. They observed how candidates performed under stress, how they cooperated with others, how they attacked problems. Mere technical expertise proved insufficient. The General Staff wanted officers capable of creative thinking, adaptation to unexpected circumstances, and the ability to inspire confidence in those below them. Those who succeeded received assignment to the General Staff, but only on probation. Permanent appointment was not guaranteed. This constituted yet another testing period. Probationary staff officers rotated through various positions, constantly evaluated. Their performance received documentation in exhaustive reports. Only after this probationary phase came permanent General Staff positions. This system cultivated an elite that possessed remarkable status within the military. General Staff officers displayed crimson stripes running down their trouser legs. Special insignia adorned their uniforms. They received particular courtesy and respect. Yet this prestige carried relentless demands. They had to demonstrate competence across multiple command levels simultaneously. They had to produce innovative responses to complicated operational challenges. When conflict began in 1939, the Kriegsakademie shut down. German military leaders predicted a quick war lasting only months. General Staff personnel were required for operational duties rather than extended training programs. Yet the system adapted with characteristic efficiency. 8-week intensive courses substituted for the 3-year program. These emphasized practical application over theory. They concentrated on tactics, supply, transportation, staff procedures, and intelligence on enemy capabilities. Participants invested more hours in map exercises and war games than in classroom instruction. The program prioritized functional abilities needed immediately in field assignments. Beginning in 1942, as demand for General Staff officers rose and casualties mounted, the program underwent restructuring. The new format incorporated 6 months of practical experience with divisional staffs, 3 months with higher-level commands, 8 weeks of formal coursework, and 6 months of probationary service. Significantly, much of this preparation occurred at or near frontline positions. German military philosophy held that warfare itself provided the finest instruction, that no classroom education could replicate combat experience. While this approach created casualties among trainees, it produced officers possessing intimate combat understanding through first-hand exposure. They did not absorb military science solely from textbooks or from instructors discussing battles they had never witnessed. They learned through direct participation, through deciding under fire, through observing consequences of their orders. The outcome was a General Staff maintaining remarkable tactical and operational proficiency, even as Germany's fortunes deteriorated after late 1942. German forces fighting retreats frequently performed more effectively than advancing Allied forces. Encircled German units resisted far longer than seemed feasible. Outnumbered German formations inflicted tremendous casualties. This resulted not merely from fanaticism. It reflected professional military competence embedded within organizational structure. The distributed command approach permitted tactical flexibility that Allied forces found difficult to match, despite recognizing its effectiveness. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel directed the 7th Panzer Division in France, he regularly made decisions contradicting orders from above. He pursued opportunities his superiors failed to anticipate because they were not present to observe them. He advanced faster than higher-level planning deemed advisable, achieving remarkable success because German doctrine rewarded results over rigid compliance with instructions. His 7th Panzer Division earned the nickname Ghost Division because superiors frequently could not determine its location. It moved so rapidly that communications lagged behind. Yet Rommel comprehended the broader campaign's purpose. Within that framework, he possessed authority to act independently, and he acted with aggression. This was not disorder or lack of discipline. It was disciplined initiative, a fundamental yet often overlooked distinction. All German commanders understood the broader operations objective through a command system emphasizing not merely what required doing, but why accomplishing it mattered. Understanding the why enabled commanders to make sound, independent decisions aligned with overall strategic intent. The commanders who received these orders had considerable flexibility in determining how they would complete their tasks. When battle conditions shifted rapidly, when unexpected opportunities emerged that the original plan hadn't considered, when enemy actions made the initial strategy impossible to follow, those in command were required to adapt immediately. Leadership at any rank that waited passively for fresh instructions was viewed as a fundamental failure. This approach carried significant dangers that grew increasingly apparent as the war continued. Commanders exercising broad autonomy could make tactical choices that didn't serve the larger strategic picture they didn't fully comprehend. When multiple units pursued their own initiatives simultaneously in different directions, the coordination between them often collapsed into chaos. As the conflict dragged on and Germany shifted from attacking to defending against mounting enemy numbers, the system revealed its weaknesses. Holding fixed defensive positions demanded tighter coordination and more centralized command structures than the decentralized approach naturally provided. Yet during the rapid offensives from 1939 through 1941, this philosophy generated an operational tempo that the Allies simply could not sustain or match. German formations moved with flexibility, seized chances as they appeared, and adapted to developing situations, while Allied units remained static, waiting for explicit permission from higher command. The impact extended beyond tactical advantages into the realm of psychology. Allied soldiers facing German forces frequently felt outmaneuvered by opponents who anticipated their movements, appeared in unexpected locations, and displayed speed that defied rational explanation. This wasn't mystical or rooted in racial mythology, as Nazi ideology insisted. This was rigorous preparation colliding with opportunity. Generations of systematic military education had produced an officer corps and enlisted force where every single leader could perform effectively at ranks above his current assignment, where taking initiative earned reward rather than punishment, where the speed of making decisions mattered more than achieving perfect plans. France's catastrophic collapse in 1940 forced British and American military leaders to fundamentally reshape their thinking about how to organize command authority and develop junior leaders. Officers from both nations studied German operational methods with intense scrutiny, analyzing what had gone catastrophically wrong and devising countermeasures. General George Patton, who had absorbed German military theory years earlier, began transplanting similar principles into the American Armored Corps, while adapting them to fit American military values and culture. He championed swift, intense, relentless offensives. He directed his subordinate commanders to maintain momentum, keep attacking the enemy without pause, and push forward to exploit successes rather than seek approval before advancing further. By 1944, when Patton's Third Army erupted from the Normandy beachhead, American fighting forces were operating at speeds that approached what the Germans had demonstrated in their best campaigns. The Soviet Union, which endured the full weight of Germany's assault when Operation Barbarossa commenced on June 22, 1941, absorbed hard lessons through devastating military defeats. That invasion employed 3 million German troops along a front stretching from the Baltic down to the Black Sea, representing the most massive military undertaking in human history. In the opening months, the Wehrmacht surrounded and destroyed hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers in massive encirclement operations at locations including Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk, Uman, and Kiev. Panzer divisions penetrated hundreds of kilometers, into Soviet territory within weeks. When 1941 ended, more than 3 million Soviet soldiers languished as prisoners of war. Germany's early victories seemed to validate every principle embedded in their military doctrine and preparation. Yet the Soviets adjusted with harsh realism. They mastered defense in depth, layered defensive positions that could withstand and absorb German breakthrough attacks without shattering into collapse. They learned to position operational reserves behind the main combat line, positioning them to counterattack German spearheads once those armored columns advanced beyond their supporting foot soldiers. They discovered that German armor columns, when they advanced with excessive speed across great distances, developed exposed flanks vulnerable to devastating attack. Crucially, Soviet commanders began matching the pace at which Germans operated and made decisions. German methods that had devastated the methodical Allied forces in France proved less effective against enemies who could match their operational speed. By 1943 at Kursk, Soviet commanders were executing complex maneuvers that rivaled German competence and sophistication. The tactical equation shifted fundamentally in Soviet favor. The Western Allies had learned to coordinate combined arms operations, matching German proficiency. They developed their own rapid command and control systems, emphasizing mission-based orders and subordinate initiative. American tank doctrine explicitly incorporated German concepts, modified to suit American conditions and capabilities. After painful defeats in North Africa, British forces rebuilt their training systems and tactical approaches from the ground up. Critically, the Allies possessed industrial capacity that Germany could never approach. America's manufacturing base alone produced more tanks, fighter aircraft, trucks, and ammunition than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. Despite losing vast territories and populations, the Soviet Union moved manufacturing facilities eastward beyond German reach and manufactured more weapons of most types than the Germans produced. No degree of tactical mastery could indefinitely overcome such overwhelming material disadvantage. Nonetheless, lessons about German military effectiveness remained instructive even as Germany faced defeat. German defenders in Normandy during 1944, fighting a losing defensive campaign against opponents with overwhelming superiority, inflicted casualty counts that disturbed Allied commanders. From June 6 through the end of August 1944, the Normandy campaign produced 83,000 casualties among British, Canadian, and Polish forces, with nearly 16,000 killed in action. The German army fought without Luftwaffe support, as Allied air superiority had neutralized German aviation. German forces confronted severe supply problems because Allied bombers and fighters interdicted transportation throughout occupied France. They faced inferiority in tanks, artillery, and numbers of soldiers. Despite these catastrophic handicaps, they exhibited tactical proficiency that extended the campaign well beyond what Allied planners had forecast. Fanaticism contributed to this performance, though ideological conviction played its part. More fundamentally, this reflected a military organization that had invested decades perfecting exactly this form of warfare. German troops at every echelon grasped their assigned tasks within the context of broader operations. They comprehended what their commanders intended to accomplish, enabling them to respond creatively when circumstances changed. Years of training had conditioned them to make decisions while under extreme pressure without seeking permission through channels. The non-commissioned officer corps deserves particular recognition in explaining German military competence. German sergeant majors and sergeants weren't merely disciplinary figures maintaining order and relaying officer instructions downward. They functioned as junior commanders systematically educated to think at ranks far exceeding their official position. A German squad leader, typically holding the rank of Oberjäger, was required to understand platoon and company operations thoroughly. The remarkable quality of German NCOs during World War II extended beyond their capacity to lead their immediate squads into the broader value they provided through thinking like officers. A squad leader needed to lead his squad competently and employ his weapons effectively, but mastery of that single level wasn't sufficient. He required the capacity to lead platoons. He needed to comprehend operations at company level. This principle operated consistently throughout every command level in the German army. Many German senior NCOs could assume officer duties if circumstances demanded, and perform their responsibilities satisfactorily. This meant that when officers fell in combat, which happened with grim frequency during intense fighting, their units maintained operational effectiveness. Leadership capability existed at every organizational level. Platoons whose officers became casualties could be commanded by senior sergeants. Companies whose commanders fell could be led by the most senior platoon sergeant until an officer replacement arrived. NCO training emphasized identical principles that officers received. They participated in tactical exercises where they grappled with decisions at company and battalion scope. They trained making judgments while experiencing time pressure using methods identical to officer preparation. They educated themselves in how various arms function together, understanding how artillery, riflemen, tanks, and air support integrated. During company and battalion training operations, a German squad leader wasn't merely observing but actively participated as a decision-maker. He comprehended how his squad's activities furthered larger company and battalion missions. This created unity and synchronized action that didn't depend absolutely on officers being physically present, directing every tactical movement. The contrast with how British and American NCOs received preparation was marked and consequential. British and American non-commissioned officers frequently demonstrated excellence at their specific level of command. A British sergeant could excel at directing his section. An American platoon sergeant could perform superbly at his duties, yet they weren't trained through systematic processes to contemplate decisions at ranks above their current position. When officers fell and became casualties, Allied units frequently experienced significant degradation in effectiveness because their NCOs lacked preparation for officer-level thinking. The German system built in the expectation that casualties would occur inevitably, that communications would fail, that confusion would dominate the battlefield. Their training reflected these realities. Every German sergeant or junior commander was prepared to function at minimum one rank higher than his current assignment. This layered leadership and redundancy produced resilience when facing the horrendous casualties common in modern warfare, particularly among junior officers. The Wehrmacht's victories in the early war years rested fundamentally on this foundation of meticulous, demanding, multi-tiered leadership education, producing commanders at every echelon from army group down to squad. This system received reinforcement from operational doctrine emphasizing speed, maneuver rather than grinding attrition, and concentration of available forces at strategically vital locations. Radio communications technology, particularly wireless sets, made possible the operational tempo that doctrine required, yet technology alone cannot account for German success. The Allies possessed radios as well. French forces had radio equipment. British units possessed excellent communications apparatus. What they lacked was a military culture that capitalized fully on what instant communication could accomplish in accelerating operational tempo. German commanders communicated with subordinates perpetually, transmitting concise updates, explaining their strategic goals, and receiving frequent reports describing battlefield developments. This generated shared battlefield awareness that permitted quick responses with minimal need for extensive coordination meetings. When tactical opportunities emerged suddenly, exploitation could commence immediately, because subordinates grasped what senior leaders wanted, accomplished, and possessed authority to move without requesting specific approval. Technology fused with doctrine created powers greater than either element could generate independently. What other military forces said afterward about German effectiveness provided the greatest validation. After defeat, American and British militaries studied German approaches with focused intensity, extracting principles they could implement. American military institutions conducted extensive debriefings with German officers and senior staff members. British military officials examined how Germans organized training and structured their command systems. Both nations recognized that German methods at operational and tactical levels had demonstrated superiority despite ultimate strategic failure and resource disadvantage. Mission-based command authority became fundamental to Allied military thinking explicitly, because experience proved its effectiveness. Orders emphasizing lower-level initiative replaced rigid command structures. Speed of decision-making became prioritized over careful deliberation. training programs were redesigned to emphasize independent action. These represented practical applications drawn from studying failure and success. America's air-land battle doctrine of the 1980s descended directly from German operational concepts originating in World War II. The emphasis on rapid decision-making, adaptable responses, coordinated employment of different weapons types, and operations deep in enemy territory all reflected principles the Wehrmacht had pioneered decades previously. Published doctrine and training curricula acknowledged this intellectual connection openly. Contemporary military organizations worldwide now center mission-based command as a cornerstone of leadership practice and operational planning. The principle that subordinates require comprehension of what senior commanders want, accomplished, and freedom to determine how to achieve those aims is considered fundamental today. Contemporary training stresses initiative and choosing wisely under time pressure. Officers learn to think 2 ranks above their current position. These concepts flow directly from how Germans organized their military. However, in 1940 this was revolutionary, not conventional. It provided Germany decisive advantage during the early war years, an edge that only disappeared once opponents mastered similar approaches and combined them with manufacturing capacity Germany couldn't manufacture. Understanding German military achievement in World War II requires recognizing how training, preparation, and operational philosophy, developed methodically across decades, produced results. This demonstrates convincingly that organizational thinking patterns, how commanders receive preparation, how decision-making processes function institutionally, these intangible elements can equal or surpass equipment and numerical strength. The Wehrmacht of 1940 possessed fewer tanks compared to Allied forces it defeated. Proportionally, it had fewer mechanized units. Overall strength comparisons were relatively comparable. However, 2 decades of investment in developing leadership at every level created commanders capable of operating at speeds the Allies couldn't initially match. This doesn't diminish the bravery, sacrifice, or eventual triumph of Allied servicemen. British, French, Polish, Belgian, and Dutch soldiers demonstrated courage against adversaries employing methods they'd never experienced and weren't trained to counter. Numerous Allied units performed admirably with the doctrinal approaches available to them. Allied troops weren't inherently inferior, but their training systems and doctrinal approaches proved inadequate for the warfare Germany introduced to Europe in 1940. The Allied adaptation, learning, and evolution under the crushing strain of combat and setbacks ultimately changed the course of the war. By 1944, British and American operations matched German speed while using far more resources. Soviet commanders had learned to apply and sometimes exceed German operational methods, employing them with the methodical intensity characteristic of Soviet military approaches. Yet in 1940, during those crucial weeks as France surrendered and Britain prepared for invasion alone against Nazi tyranny, the German military displayed unmistakably what 2 decades of dedicated preparation could accomplish. Training beginning during the limited years of the 1920s, when German rearmament occurred in secrecy, created an officer corps obsessed with excellence. Doctrine drawing from centuries of Prussian military tradition adapted to modern warfare created approaches that fundamentally altered combat methods. A command philosophy trusting junior commanders to exercise independent judgment within understood strategic intent created organizational flexibility opponents couldn't approach. These components merged to create victories exceeding normal military expectations and alarming democratic nations globally. These principles remain strikingly applicable for analyzing military power beyond simple arithmetic of equipment quantities and unit counts. Fighting effectiveness doesn't originate solely from counting tanks or divisions on strength returns. At its core, military capability reflects how forces organize training, how personnel make decisions, whether initiative gets rewarded or discouraged, how leaders throughout the organization understand their responsibilities within bigger pictures. The 1940 German military had systematized these intangible components into an organized doctrine that permanently transformed warfare. This system eventually fractured when ambition exceeded feasible limits and overwhelming Allied superiority in manufacturing, and numbers overwhelmed German capabilities. No tactical brilliance survives fighting simultaneously the British Dominion, Soviet Union, and United States. Yet those tactical and operational methods survived German military defeat, receiving intense scrutiny and adoption in modified form by Germany's conquerors. Looking back at World War II scholarship examining German effectiveness, historians consistently reach identical conclusions across decades of research. Germany established a military organization prioritizing intellectual speed as significantly as physical velocity, instructing every leader to exceed their assigned rank, permitting subordinates to exercise initiative within understood intentions. This generated an operational pace and tactical achievement enemies initially couldn't counter. That advantage lasted merely until enemies assimilated similar methods and implemented them with greater resources. Yet for a defining historical moment, it produced victories reshaping the conflict and showing principles that would reshape modern warfare fundamentally. Nazi claims of German invincibility weren't justified. Rather, Germany employed principles opponents hadn't yet acquired, executed by commanders educated meticulously across 20 years. When those principles became common knowledge, when Allied forces embraced comparable methods and reinforced them with overwhelming manufacturing capacity and numbers, the German advantage evaporated entirely. But the historical accomplishment deserves recognition when examined independent from Nazi ideology. Through disciplined training, unified doctrine, and command philosophy granting subordinates autonomy, Germany established a force defeating numerically stronger enemies through operational pace, coordination, and initiative. That achievement, now studied by professional militaries worldwide, testifies to the enduring influence of organizational philosophy, professional preparation of personnel, and leadership execution during combat. Methods the Wehrmacht pioneered, divorced from association with Nazi totalitarianism, became foundational elements of contemporary military thinking and continue explaining military effectiveness today. The evolution of men like British officer Ian Roger English, who experienced German effectiveness personally and subsequently became a highly decorated combat leader, symbolizes broader recognition that Germany's military accomplishments warranted serious study, even by those who fought against it. English himself would receive the Military Cross 3 times for his leadership and tactical proficiency, embodying lessons derived from confronting an enemy that had transformed modern warfare. His progression from witnessing German tactical skill at Dunkirk in May 1940 through becoming merely one of 24 British servicemen receiving the Military Cross 3 times during the war demonstrates the broader Allied educational process. German military achievement represents no narrative of supremacy or inherent superiority. Rather, it chronicles what dedicated preparation, consistent thinking, and demanding training accomplish when pursued deliberately across generations. It exemplifies how organizational values, the practice of enabling lower-level decision-making, and the competitive advantage deriving from deciding more quickly than opponents can respond, become decisive factors. These principles transcend particular historical periods and remain applicable for any group competing within complicated, evolving conditions. Germany's opening successes demonstrated that accomplishment emerges not merely from possessing resources, but from organizing, training, and employing those resources effectively. The subsequent Allied triumph demonstrated that even stronger methods become manageable when adversaries commit seriously to learning and support adaptation with overwhelming material resources. The complete narrative stretching from German military innovation through how the Allies adapted and ultimately defeated Germany offers wisdom regarding military effectiveness, how organizations absorb lessons, and how tactical proficiency connects to larger strategic outcomes that military professionals examine continually. The structures making Germany effective during World War II persist in contemporary military thinking, representing an enduring consequence of systematic preparation, meeting the test of actual warfare.